Well, hello, good people. This is a gloriously unplanned film. I need to take this JAP engine apart this afternoon. It's the old one at my Aeronca. It was fitted in 1970, new old stock. It came out in 2015 when it was a little unwell. It needs a new crankshaft. Fortunately, I have a brand new crankshaft and rods, all delightfully overhauled and ready to go. I also have another spare crankshaft as well. This engine's done 550 hours and it's going to get an overhaul during the winter. But a friend of mine up in Devon has got an engine that's done allegedly around 430 hours and he's wondering whether he should overhaul it or not. Rather than him tearing his engine to pieces for no good reason, I've had a look inside and it looks okay, but I suggested it might be worthwhile me taking this engine apart now and measuring the crank pins and bearings. I can use Plastigauge to assess the clearance. Of course, I've got the manual, which does have some clearance fits in it as well for overhaul. If you're wondering why it needs a new crankshaft, well, there you go. Before we start, I'm just going to clear this stuff out of the way. And turn the engine around. We'll start on the back. In fact, I can lay it down forward. It hasn't got much oil in it. There we go. The first thing that needs to come off is these two braces. They're only fitted to the British engines. If you've got an American Aeronca engine, then you've probably got single ignition. But I think the American dual ignition engines were a bit like the Praga engine with the two magnetos mounted together. I've never seen one. I'm no expert on the Aeronca engines at all. I know my way around the JAP, but I've only looked at Aeronca engines perfunctorily. I know they're 99% the same, but certain sort of detail is different. This arrangement here was a purely British arrangement. And in fact, quite a few of the aeroplanes that came over new, including my Aeronca in 1936, had this gearbox arrangement fitted to the back of an American Aeronca engine. So it's not unusual to find hybrid engines. The engine on Gladys, the delightful Aeronca that's up in Yorkshire, has got a hybrid. That's a hybrid Aeronca JAP engine with this back case and all the rest of it on an Aeronca crankcase. And I'll just take this one off. It was quite a clever solution for fitting twin magnetos and never gave any trouble in service, but it's not particularly light. I'm going to find a pot for all these nuts and washers actually. This is the oil pump. It's rather a clever pump arrangement because it scavenges from this case into the sump forward, and then it's also pressure on the other side and takes from the sump through a strainer into the pump and then up an oil gallery that normally screws in here and goes sort of upwards and then feeds the main bearings, the skew gearbox, the oil pressure relief valve, and has a little tapping off to the oil pressure gauge as well. Anyway, so the big nut's already gone, so let's just take these two off. It's a submerged pump as well, of course. Although it's a sort of semi-dry sump arrangement, it's still, when the oil is settled in the bottom of the engine, when it's not running, the pump is submerged. So it always has really good oil pressure on start straight away, and this sort of waiting for the system to prime or anything. The needle comes up on the gauge within a couple of seconds. Right, I'm just going to get a rubber mallet. The perils of filming and working at the same time are many. I just managed to take the oil pump off and all the rest of it and tell you all manner of interesting things and realise I hadn't turned the microphone on. There we are. This pump was fitted by me, I should think, 2005, 2006, when the airplane had a bit of a birthday, before I had it flying again after the children were born. Very simple pump, so it's got two separate chambers, but during the winter when we actually do the engine overhaul, I'll have a pump completely to pieces and we'll go through exactly how it all works. But from beyond the oil pump, nothing else has been apart. I might have changed the odd nut and bolt, but the back case and the gearbox have never been off from when it was built in the factory in 1936, as far as I can tell. I'll make all new gaskets out of that lovely flexoid paper. They'll be far better than these ones. This pipe here is the return pipe for the crankcase breather system. When I turn the propeller over without the engine running, you'll hear that wonderful kind of wheezing and coughing sound. I think Arthur Ord Hume delightfully described it as a octogenarian with bad catarrh, which is a rather lovely way of describing the sound. Well, this is the bit that makes the kind of gurgling sucking sound as it sucks the oil through a one-way valve back through into the back of the crankcase. With those minor pipes and bits gone, I can now undo the nuts around here, take this timing case and the bevel or skew gearbox, to be more correct, straight back off the engine. Again, I'm not going to strip this down today. I'm just going to take it all off as one unit. It's easier to store. We can look at one in the winter. So there's about 7 or 8 quarter BSF nuts to come off. There are actually 9 nuts, so I counted them as I went. So the best way to get this off carefully is actually to bash lightly on the back of the table here and sort of work the timing case off the studs. Oh, it's actually coming loose very quickly and easily. A few washers to hook out of the system. Couldn't get them off the studs before. There we are. And let's see what stays put and what falls out. That's the drive for the rev counter that's just come out. There we are. Goes in there. That there is the drive that goes into the skew gearbox. It was one of those I shortened last year. My pal welded a new flange on with his TIG welder when I made the single ignition engine from a dual ignition one for the Aeronca C2, because that was a couple of years ago now. Right, this gearbox can just have a quick mop up and then be put straight away into storage. It's going to mop the oil off the bottom of it and stick it in a cardboard box. This plate here holds the rear main bearing, which is here, and so before that can come off, there's a few things that need to come out of the way. This is the oil pump drive gear that just slides out, sits in a little bushing there. It's bushed straight into the aluminium of the crankcase. There's no actual separate plain bush, although I suppose if that was very worn, it would be possible to machine the case and put a bronze or one of those sort of sintered bronze bearings in there, which would be quite a nice fix actually. Otherwise, this gear comes straight off. It's just an idler. There's timing marks. Oh yes, that's the little dinky doo that feeds the oil. I'll put that away. It sits on there, and the oil squirt from the main oil feed goes through it. It sort of makes a seal and goes straight into the back of the crankshaft there. This gear lifts off, but I won't lift it off yet. There's a couple of reasons. There's a timing mark there. If I turn it all, I can't grab the front of the crankshaft to turn it because the front of the crankshaft's missing. What happened there? So there's 2 timing marks here, a little dot there, dot there, dot there, and that's how they're timed up. Simple as that. So this one lifts out the way, but I'm not going to yet because there's a split pin here that needs to be removed so the camshaft gear can come off. And then top engine mount needs to come off, the oil pressure relief valve and the crankcase breather as well. These breathers, if you ever have to change one on the airplane in situ, an absolute swine. That nut is almost impossible to reach. I've had to do it once, it took hours, and the amount of appalling language was truly astonishing. I've just wrestled the nut off the end of the camshaft there. It wasn't actually very difficult. The pin was a little bit of a sod to get out, the split pin. So I turned the camera off so I could use extra bad language and not be demonetized by YouTube. I'll show you something interesting though, is just so you get the camshaft gear in the right place. I just wiped it off, bring it closer to the camera. You'll see it's on the top there, there's another dot. And that just lines up with a dot on the camshaft end as well. It's all really quite well thought out. That little slot is the rev counter drive, and then below it, but in the same plane, is a little drilling for the split pin for the nut. So this can come off now. This just lifts off in the gears. And so, now this is interesting. This is the flutter plate. Now this, I'll just show you, I'll bring it up to the camera again. This has got holes on one side, so that's the crankcase side, and that's the outer side into the breather. And so it can only breathe out through the flutter plate and can only breathe in through that little pipe that I removed earlier. So that's how it separates the air and the oil and stops wasting all the oil from the crankcase, because of course every time this thing rotates through 180 degrees, it either expels or inhales 1860 cc's worth of air, because in that air is a lot of oil as well. This is a remarkably good system for separating the oil in the air as a breather system. I know it's got sort of slightly bad breath, but actually it doesn't use any oil at all. Between oil changes, I bet I only put about a quart in it every 20 hours or something. It's quite astonishingly good. I don't believe this top engine mount bolt is very tight, because I used the old mounts on the new engine, so no, it's not actually. I hardly needed a spanner on it. It's a bit tight, they're quite coarse threaded into the crankcase proper. I'll get it out and show you anyway. I don't need to remove these. Again, I think I changed them, because the ones that were on the, well, on this engine obviously went onto the new engine. There we are. Quite a long, deep, coarse thread on there. Seems to work very well. You'll have to excuse me using adjustable spanners. I don't have every spanner size in the world. This shouldn't be too tight either. There we go. That undoes like so, and then some padding around that, or cloth around it. It's actually, it's sort of hand tight. This is on a very long tube, you'll see as I withdraw it, because it doesn't just put oil back into the crankcase itself, it puts it into the sort of front area, so it runs down into the sump. Otherwise it would just add to the kind of oily mist that is already racing around. So that's the oil pressure relief valve tube. So it goes forward of the front main bearing and into the front bit of the crankcase. We'll look at it at a later date. I can go in the box for now. So all we need to do now is remove, there's one more bit of the oil breather system actually, there we are. That just goes with the flutter plate, that little separator. Again, it's just to try and catch as much oil in the crankcase instead of whooshing out of the breather. I've got hundreds of those, there's a whole string of them down in the hangar. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 4 nuts, and then this back plate should come off. I've removed all the fixings, so it's time now to try and pull this off. This has been on for 80 years, so nearly 90 years. It might not want to move. I don't want to bang lots of wedges down inside to the edge of the crankcase and things and sort of scab up the aluminium, although I might end up having to just persuade it a little bit with a screwdriver. I'd really rather not do any more of that than I absolutely need to. Might try just a little bit here, but I'd sort of do it somewhere where it's not going to affect the sealing of the crankcase too much. Just try it a tiny bit here. If I can get something just to push forward on the edges there, that might be the answer. Well, I haven't used too much bad language or nasty tools. I've managed to loosen it off. Actually, I'm whacking away with some MDF and a hammer, but I was standing right in front of the camera for most of it, so not really much point you having a picture of my back and bad language for several minutes. But it is coming off slowly. Keep wiggling it. Oh, there we go. Excellent. There's the back of the crankshaft. Now just again, the sort of places where I instantly look to see how wear is. This is the main bearing track, the rear main bearing. And the main bearings are wide, they're these rollers. They're the same as on the Praga engine, and they tend to last for a long, long time. The thing that kills them is corrosion, not wear. That doesn't appear to have much corrosion, so I've got gloves on. I'll have a feel my finger in a bit, but actually that looks very good. Excellent. That piece of wood was jammed in there just from undoing the nut, so nothing would turn. This can go in the box. Let's turn this round, and we need to undo one more thing. And I have a small admission to make as well. Well, it won't stand up now. Okay, yes it does stand up. The thrust bearing is behind this plate. Normally this plate's wire locked. I've taken the locking wire off. Normally the bolts are a little tighter as well. There's a reason for that. Outside diameter of this plate is the same as this machined housing in front of the crankcase. And the idea is you can pull this forward. Now, a very common problem I've come across on pretty much every JAP I've come across, including this one, is that when these things have been put down in the past, this has been bashed in. And on several occasions I've come across ones where it's been pushed in quite a lot. The casting becomes very thick very quickly. So it's not a structural problem, but it's an absolute swine to get this plate off. Anyway, a while back I made a couple of these sort of stove hooks that you can slide in and wiggle this cover off. It's about the best way of doing it. I made them for doing another engine, but I've kept them. Normally there's a nut on here, so I have to confess I took this cover off the other day and took the nut off by more unusual means. It's a nut with a tab washer behind it. Now normally there's the crankshaft out here with a screw thread on the end, of course, and a nice big nut that holds the propeller hub on. Of course, one can take the big C spanner with the right size socket on, put that on there, various bits of wooden packing, and then stick the nut on. This can't come off in a million years. And then, of course, using a piece of pipe, one can absolutely heave away on the nut until it comes loose. They're usually very tight. But the last one I did, I actually strapped the engine on its stand next to the bench so it couldn't pull the engine over, or it would have to pull the bench over with it. It sort of jumped up and down for a while, and suddenly the nut came loose. But with this nasty end of crankshaft here, I decided an easier way of getting the nut off, given that I've got a whole box full of spares, was to actually pot mark it gently and drill it and split it with a cold chisel, which I did last week. It's not as if I was going to damage the crankshaft. So with all that done, crankshaft can come out. It comes out backwards, so I'll turn the engine round again. When one puts these together, it's generally with the crank and rods together. Now this is just gasket here, which I don't really want to knacker up. Well, I suppose I've torn it anyway, so who cares? But there we are. We've got a template for making new ones. So there's a cut out there and a cut out there, and that's the dipstick. Now the dipstick has to be unclipped inside the sump normally, but I'll show that in a subsequent film. But if the rods are on, then the little ends would be there. You sort of fold the whole thing up at bottom dead center and can put the crank in or out complete with its rods, which is a very good way of doing it. But obviously I've taken the rods off this already, so I can give the end of the crankshaft a bit of a wallop. Not going to damage it anymore. There it goes. There we are. One gloriously broken crankshaft. But the crank pins look quite good. So I'm going to give it a quick clean up and then we'll try and measure it. I'll just move the camera so you can have a look inside the bottom of the crankcase. There's the camshaft with its roller followers. Take heed of that, Mr. Lycoming, in your nasty cheap chilled cast iron rubbish. All I'm doing is pushing, using a scriber, pushing the follower against the camshaft and wiggling it a little bit. I've done 2 already, that's 3 now. Making sure the rollers are turning, which they are. On the JAP engine that's now on the Aeronca C2, I had a couple of jammed rollers and they actually had flats worn on them. I had some spare rollers, so I changed them, but they have to be changed quite carefully. It hadn't done any damage to the camshaft, so I doubt they'd been seized for very long. Anyway, they're turning very well. That's fine. Good. I'm going to bag this crankcase up. It's going to go in a bin liner and go up in the top of the store along with several other crankcases. And in the winter, we'll have it out and take the camshaft out, put it through the wash bath and start building it up again. I don't know whether you good people have used this plastic gauge stuff. I have very occasionally. It's good stuff. These little rods of, well, plastic, oddly enough. And basically you put a piece of it on a bearing and then do the bearing up with a cap and everything, and it squidges out, and then you measure how thick the squidgy bit of what was plastic string is that's nicely stuck to the journal. I had a bit of a mess around off camera the other day with another crankshaft, and well, it was all quite entertaining really. So just bear with me whilst I do this. It's one of those jobs where you need to be an octopus and have about 8 hands. One of the oddities with these Aeronca bearings is that the shell bearing itself is very thick wall. It's not springy like a Van der Velde bearing, more modern bearings we're used to. They're a very, very good machine fit into the cap and the rod, but they don't really stay in place unless, well, there's no real way of keeping them in place other than very careful assembly. It's one of the reasons why actually putting the rods together in the crankcase is an absolute devil, because they just want to slide out. They are tabbed, and the tabs go tab to tab just like our normal Van der Velde bearing, but they all need to go together clean because you don't want anything on the back of the bearing here. And then the back of the shell needs to be nice and clean as well. And then that can go in like so. What I'm going to do is put a piece of the plastic gauge on the crankshaft there, then stand the rod in place and carefully then drop the cap on and do it up. That's the theory anyway. The plastic gauge wants to run away as well because there's nothing really sticking it in place, so the tiniest dab of Vaseline on the journal, I think they do say silicone grease otherwise, but there's no reason not to use Vaseline. And then a little piece of plastic gauge. Well, stuck in place. Stick to my finger rather than the blasted journal. That's it. Okay, I want it a bit straighter than that. I don't want to skew the readings by making the bearing look better than it is. I want the sort of truest of readings I can get. That's it, that's nice and straight. Right, let's turn it up the other way now. You can see the little worm of plastic gauge stuck under there. Now, the forward cylinder is the port cylinder, and the rod is slightly offset, so that goes towards the centre, goes to the back. So, shell bearings in place, it's all clean, not covered in sawdust. Let's lift that in. I've got all this set up like this because I've got a thick lump of rag, a piece of wood under the little end, so it's holding the rod just about in the right place, but not too hard against the journal. Then I can drop the top cap on, but it's all a bit of a sod because you've got to put the bearing on and then drop the cap onto the bearing. Well, that's in the right place there. Make sure it's just pushed down each side so it's flush, which it is. Then we want the cap. When I put crankshafts and bearings together normally, I do it in slightly more clinical conditions than here, but it's such a nice afternoon and it's a rather broken crankshaft that I think we can get away with this. Right, well that's gone on. What we do now is put the nuts on and do them up nice and tight. I'd like to tell you what torque figure it is, but there aren't any. So tight is what I use. Now those are up tight. Of course, if I went for the really tight setting, all it would do is squidge the plastic gauge even more. So actually, I want to be a bit of a pessimist with this. So I reckon that will do it. So let's take these off now. Now if I turn, oh yes, there's a nice squidged out line. I turn the crankshaft so it faces you. There's the line of plastic gauge. Now, the less squidged it is, the wider the bearing for 3. So on that, it's somewhere between 3 and 4 thou. And the book figure is 2.5 thou. It's 0.0025 is the upper limit. Well, I've saved you the agony of watching me cut more plastic gauge and wiggle it into place, but I assure you there's a piece just under there, you can just see it. And I'm going to put the second rod in place now. I'll measure this bearing as well. Okay, that's on. Now, if anything, it's squidged out a little bit more than on the other one. Yes, about 2.5. It's certainly less than 3. So 2.5, and I reckon the other one was 3.5. Now, interestingly, it's always said the oil feeds in this way, and that this crank pin gets the lion's share of the oil feed. And it's interesting to see that this forward crank pin is the one that is more worn. I suppose the one other thing I ought to do is measure the crank pins with a micrometer and see how out of round they are. 18695, almost 1870. Or is it the other way? Or worn the other way? Yes, 1868. So 1870, let's write these down. 1870 on the major axis, 1868 on the minor. Again, 1870. Walks across the bearing. 1868. So the pins are the same. They've got the same amount of wear. So the difference appears to be in the bearings. Well, I suppose that's quite interesting, really. So maybe this pin isn't robbed too much of oil. It's just that front bearing's a little bit more worn. One thing we haven't done is a quick look at the bearing surfaces. This is the rod bearing off of the port journal, and it's not bad. It's the one that was slightly more worn, with about 3.5 thou of wear. And that's the cap bearing as well. Again, not bad, slightly discoloured, but a certain amount of bearing material left, and not scratched at all or scored in any nasty way. Likewise, here's the rear ones, or the starboard. A little bit better. Of course, the bearing measured at about 2.5 thou or so, so that was definitely a better bearing. Although the crank pin itself had the same amount of wear as the forward crank pin. This engine, before the crankshaft broke, we'll put the broken crankshaft aside rather, or breakages. That has now been, I believe, touch wood, largely resolved through regular testing and better lapping of hubs and all manner of other things, which I'll cover in another film. But this engine was running very well before the crankshaft broke. It had good oil pressure, and although, yes, I think we can sort of conclude it's just below limits now, and one wouldn't probably put it together and run it again with that sort of amount of wear. It'd be a polish of the crank and remetal the bearings. It certainly had good oil pressure and was a perfectly okay engine to use. So I reckon 500 hours is a reasonable time in which to pull one of these and possibly measure the crank and rods. I don't think my pal's engine has done anywhere near 500 hours. The logbook says 400 and a bit, but having looked inside, it's a lot cleaner than this one. So I think he ought to carry on running it for another 100 hours or so and then do something about it. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching.